So don't worry about writing down every word that you see. I want you to get the general idea of the story. Your story is the most important part. Okay? So don't worry about copying down every word. Our goal here today is to map the progress of the gospel in continental Europe. The readings that you did the last 2 nights were about Britain. And of the European nations, at least the northern European nations, the gospel got its foothold in Britain before it got its foothold in the rest of northern Europe. And that's largely due to the fact that Britain belonged to the Roman Empire. So Spain and Italy got the gospel during the apostolic ages. And as the Roman Empire spread, it took Christianity, and at least took Christians with it. That's why Britain got it first. But Northern Europe was not conquered by Rome. And so we're looking today at how Northern Europe got the gospel. So this is a picture of the Roman Empire. And this is the Roman Empire at its height, right? And you'll notice that modern-day France, modern-day Belgium, and where Holland is, were Roman. And Germany and Denmark and all of that stuff was not. And so the British were largely, the ones we're going to follow today, were largely responsible for evangelizing Northern Europe. So we're going to learn some stories about them. And there's some really cool stories to be told. So don't worry about every word. Get an idea of what we're talking about here. So the first guy I want to talk to you about is actually not a Brit. The others are. Saint Eloi. Obviously, he wasn't born saint, but he has been since called such. Saint Eloi is an excellent example of a wealthy person who gives his heart to Jesus, and what a wealthy person can do when they give their heart to Jesus. There's lots of examples in the Bible, lots of verses in the Bible that talk about how dangerous it is to be wealthy and how easily you fall in love with your money instead of with God. And Jesus says things like it's easier for easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get to heaven. That doesn't mean it's impossible. But people who have a lot tend to be distracted by the stuff they have. And you find fewer of them, proportionally, that are passionate lovers of God. This is a great example of a very wealthy person who gave his heart completely to the Lord. So he was a goldsmith, which means everything he made was very expensive. He made a throne for at the time, not Holy Roman Emperor yet, but the king of the Franks. He made a throne. You know that cost a lot of money. Very wealthy guy. While he was working during his career, he would use his wealth to buy slaves and set them free. That's a cool ministry. He'd go to a slave market and he'd buy people, and then he'd say, "You're free." He would redeem them and set them free, which is awesome. It's a great hobby. That's better than playing golf with your hundreds of dollars, right? So he bought slaves and set them free. He also paid for the establishment of monasteries. He believed in the ministry of monks to the poor, and the best way to get more monks to minister to the poor is to build more monasteries where there are more people. So he financed the building of monasteries. And then when he retired, he had a bunch of money still that he had, right? And he retired, he stopped his business as a goldsmith, and he said, "Okay, Lord, I'm an old guy with resources. What do I need to do?" And the Lord called him to be a missionary to Flanders. Now, Flanders, if you remember the map I just showed you, Flanders was part of the Roman Empire, so he didn't go foreign. But he went to a different people group, and he preached the gospel. And he died in the mid-650s, and he was a missionary for the last 7 years of his life. So, really cool story of this guy, and it's just a good example of an affluent person who decided to give their resources to the service. So lots of poor people were benefited by him, either because he set them free from slavery or because he built a monastery so that they could be ministered to by the monks. Very cool story. Another guy. Let me move my video so that you can read this. There you go. Wilbert of Northumbria. So he's drawn in this fancy getup. I'm sure that's not what he looked like. But the Catholic Church, when they called him a saint, now you have to picture him all fancy. But he was from the very, very north reaches of the British Empire. He was a British citizen, but from the absolute northernmost stretches of the Roman Empire, right? And he was called initially. He thought he initially was going to be a monk. That's what he set out to do with his life, to be a monk. And then while he was going through the process of learning the monastic life, he was called to be a missionary to the Dutch. So now he's crossing the line from Britain to the Germanic northern tribes. The people of his day would have called those people barbarians. Those are my folks, right? I'm from Holland. My people were called barbarians at this time. And so he was taking his life in his hands because the Rhine River, which you can see flowing on this map here, and it flows through this area. The Rhine River more or less served as the northernmost boundary of the Roman Empire. And if barbarians crossed the Rhine, they died. And if Romans crossed the Rhine, they died. There was a very, very militarized frontier along the river. He decided he was going to go there. So you would think that if he decided he was going to go there, he'd kind of watch his P's and Q's and try to be gentle and kind and meek because he's in enemy territory and everybody wants to kill him because he's a Roman. But that's not the approach he took. His approach was very, very aggressive. Very aggressive. He would walk into town, go to the local pagan temple, and destroy the altar. That's a fine how do you do, right? And his ministry tactic was he would destroy the altar and anger everybody in town. And they would want to kill him. But then he would stop them just long enough to say, if your God is real, your God will do it for you. And he would convince them to let him live amongst them where he just desecrated their temple. And they all thought he was going to die because he just insulted their God. But he proved to them by doing such that their God didn't exist. Their God was fake. He was just fine. And so town after town, he would walk into town, destroy an altar, survive long enough to demonstrate to them that their God is fake, and then teach them about Jesus. It was a very effective ministry technique, and every time he did it, he could have been killed. But he didn't. So it's really, really cool. He built a small church in Utrecht, and that church is a very significant Catholic church, and we'll learn about that in a couple of weeks. The Church of Utrecht is called a schismatic church. They still call themselves Catholics, but they do not acknowledge the Pope, which is an interesting thing. So he was obviously Catholic. This is way before the Reformation. He's planted Catholicism, but he was not a big fan of the Pope. And the church that was his main center of operations to this day does not acknowledge the papacy, which is interesting. He was on there's a cool story that he was on a journey from one village to another, and he and his companions had run out of water. And in Holland, there's water everywhere. That's why they wear wooden shoes, because other shoes would rot. And so water is everywhere. So you don't take a lot of water with you. But they happened to be going through a dry area. There was not enough rainfall, and they were dying of thirst. And he prayed that God would save them, and God gave him a feeling, a revelation. I don't know what it was, but somehow he knew where to dig. And he dug down just 5 or 6 feet, and water filled the hole. And so his people were saved by a spring that was shown to him by divine revelation. So that's kind of cool. Really, really neat story of a guy. And now he's drawn with this fancy hat. I doubt that he walked into pagan villages looking like that at all. But he's now, St. Wilbert, so we have to draw fancy. This is the church in Utrecht. He didn't build this building. This is the second church building. but it's the same congregation. The congregation in this church is nearing 1,400 years old. So the church has been around a long time. And this is a gorgeous building. The picture doesn't really pick up on it, but the second building that's there now, this church I've been in, this is my picture. And they used green and pink stones as they were making this. So a lot of it is the regular stone gray that you see lots of places, but somehow they quarried pink and green stones as well and used them for decoration, and it's just awe-inspiring. And back to you, just want to open that up. Okay. Here's another guy, Boniface. Another British person, but he's from the south. He's from Wales. Okay. A little bit later, 680. He's called the Apostle to the Germans. He was a monk, and he was the third person who tried to bring the gospel to the Germans, and the other two people had been killed. So it's quite a unique calling, right? God has called me to bring the gospel to the Germans. Cool. Who else has gone there? Two other guys. How'd they do? They both died. Okay. Well, good luck with that. But he decided to go there. He had a very similar tactic to Wilbur. He would walk in town and disrupt the pagan worship and say, see, your God didn't kill me. His claim to fame, though, was there was an oak tree in Germany that was sacred to Thor, and they believed that it was actually planted by Thor. And you know that Thor is not just a comic book hero, right? He's a pagan god. And so they believed that this particular oak tree had been planted by Thor, and that Thor would come and manifest himself in the branches of the tree. And you could go to the tree, and there were stories of Thor showing up as a young man sitting in the branches. It was probably just a young man sitting in the branches. But anyway, this oak tree was sacred to Thor. He walked up to the oak tree and cut the tree down. So very, very gutsy. And again, remember, the last two people that tried to go to Germany were killed. So his tactic was, let me go cut down their oak tree. That'll work. He goes there. He cuts down the oak tree. He proves that Thor is not real. Very similar tactic to Wilbur, right? And he converted a lot of Germans to Christianity, and was very, very, very effective at that. He didn't travel around the country. Once he set up his home base, he stayed there. He was eventually killed by Germans who were angry that he had cut down their tree and did not afterwards become Christians. So they killed him with an axe in 754, and he died with, some people say, the same axe he cut down the oak tree with. I don't know if that's true or not, but they killed him with at least the kind of tool that he had cut down the oak tree with. So he was martyred for his faith, but many years later, there was a big gap of time between those two events. He is also the reason we have Christmas trees in our houses at Christmas. It's because of Boniface. So the Germans at that time worshipped Thor, was one of their principal deities, and a couple of other deities as well, and they thought that these deities would manifest themselves in groves of trees. And so at the winter solstice, part of the worship service of pagans in this time was to go and sacrifice and worship in evergreen groves. And so they were going out to the trees. Well, their religion taught them that if the tree was not living, that you couldn't do your thing there. And because they had to worship at a living evergreen tree. So Boniface, keeping to his ways of let me disrupt you as much as I can, cut down evergreen trees at winter solstice. And he would take them into his home. And initially it was to keep them away from pagans and not let them go to the place where he thought they were going to go worship. Obviously there's a lot more evergreen trees, you can't cut them all down, but he would say that he would hear that they're going to go out to this particular place and he'd go cut down some trees. Just to anger them. And then he eventually started teaching people to do this as well. And then he actually created a habit of hanging the Christmas trees upside down from the ceiling. And he used it as an example of the Trinity, because a Christmas tree has 3 points, right? It's like a triangle, and it's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in one thing. And so that's kind of where it got started. Eventually, we stopped hanging it from the ceiling and started putting on stands. And nobody cuts down a Christmas tree to keep pagans from worshiping that anymore. But that's kind of where it got started. So if you think of Boniface, think about trees. Boniface is Mr. Tree. He cut down the oak of Thor, and he started the Christmas tree thing on homes. Okay. Ansgar. Loved this guy. If I ever had a son, I would try to get my wife to agree to having him named Ansgar. Phenomenal story. His mom dies when he's a baby. He's raised in an abbey, so he's raised amongst nuns, right? He's an orphan, raised in a monastery. And when he's a young man, he's praying. He accepts Christ obviously at a very early age when you're raised in a monastery or in a convent. You know about Jesus at a very early age. He's praying and he's asking the Lord what to do with his life. And God says, you're going to minister to the Danish. He's like, okay, how? I'm incredibly poor. I'm a young dude. He's living in the area of Paris. He's a Frenchman. And he says, I don't know how I'm going to get to Denmark. I have no resources. And he's a really young guy at this point. Nobody's going to take him seriously and give him loads of cash to go travel to Denmark. After he was called to minister to the Danes, the Danish king was kicked out of Denmark. The Danish king was exiled, and the Danish people overthrew him. And the Danish king and the French king were friends. So the Danish king came and lived in the palace in Paris. That's really convenient. God's called me to minister to the Danish, and the Danish king is now living in town. So Ansgar meets him, converts him to Christianity, and hangs out with him and becomes a friend of the Danish king. Eventually, the Danish king tries to take his kingdom back, and he journeys. Ansgar goes with him to Denmark, and so they're up in Copenhagen now. And he sets up his kingdom again, and for a while, Ansgar is the king's assistant and part of the royal court, and is able to speak freely and teach about Christianity. Well, the Danish also worship that Germanic pagan deity group of Odin and Thor and those sorts of people, right? And they don't like the idea that their king is a Christian and the king doesn't worship the right gods from their perspective. So once again, the Danish king is exiled. He's kicked out of his kingdom twice. The second time he lands in Hamburg. So now he's in German territory. And Ansgar goes with him. So Ansgar is now kicked out of Denmark. But Ansgar makes the most of it and converts tons of people in Hamburg to Christianity. And so he's spreading the gospel there. And some Swedes that were in Hamburg because they were trading, you can see it's just across the Baltic Sea. They were Swedish people selling their wares in Hamburg. They become Christians. And they go back to Stockholm, and they tell the king about Jesus. And the king is intrigued. He's never heard about Jesus. And the king says, I want to talk to this Ansgar guy about Jesus. So Ansgar gets on a boat and sails for Stockholm, but he's attacked by Vikings. Vikings are totally dominating the Baltic Sea at this time. He survives, but he has nothing. He arrives absolutely penniless, with not even all the clothes that should have been on his back. But the king receives him, and he preaches his ongoing theme is that Christ is greater than Thor. And the Swedes, in large numbers, accept Christ. They were a lot easier audience for some reason than the Danish, and I don't know enough about the two different people groups to tell you why, but the Danish largely rejected Christianity, and the Swedes largely embraced it. So this guy just obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. He knew God had called him to evangelize the far north of Europe, and he didn't let his poverty stop him. He didn't let the fact that the king who had kind of adopted him kept getting kicked out of his throne stop him. He didn't let being attacked by Vikings stop him. He just kept saying, no, God's called me to do this. I'm going to do this. And I'm going to do this wherever I find myself until I die. And he wound up dying at a ripe old age because the king had embraced Christianity and made Ansgar the I don't know, they didn't call it archbishop or something like that, but he was the head of the Christian church for Sweden. If you read his life story, there are tons of miracles that supposedly he did. If even a third of them are true, this guy was an incredible miracle worker by the Holy Spirit. So healings, altering weather phenomenon, striking down attacking armies, like incredible things that he supposedly did. Oftentimes, stories that are written by monks, you have to kind of squint at and go, is that real? But like I said, if even a third of what he said is true, God used him in incredible ways to display his power. So, really cool story. Penniless, but committed to the cause. And that's my last guy. So, those four people, 2 French people, 2 British people, going to where the gospel had not yet been. And I just kind of wanted you to have that story in your head. Think about it. All of these people were touched by monasticism in some way. Wilbur thought he was going to be a monk and said, no, you're not. Boniface was a monk, and then went and did this. Eloy built monasteries because he believed in their ministry, and then he became a missionary. And Ansgar was raised in a convent. So when we talk about the fact that monks and the monastic life is about seclusion, it is for them. But all 4 of the people who brought the gospel to Northern Europe were in some way associated with monasticism. So it's not all bad. We want to make sure that we have a balanced view of the church history. And Jesus says, go to all the world, and most of the time the monk stays in his bedroom. And that's a problem. But in these cases, we have people associated with monasticism going where the gospel has never been before and preaching Christ and having great results. So there you go. Any questions, comments, reactions? What do you think about these stories? No?
Smash the idols.
Yeah.